Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. In my view, ASA is one of the preeminent animal studies associations in the world. We're very lucky to have it in Australia and New Zealand, helping us out, in Australasia, helping us out. So ASA has a fantastic website. It also has a very active Facebook page, and it will be hosting a conference in New Zealand in the middle of 2019. So ASA is a really good organisation. There's plenty going on at the website and the Facebook page. So get over there and support ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This episode of Knowing Animals is also brought to you by MC Pony. Now, have you been over to MC Pony's website? It's vegan enthused, but that's not all. It's also MC Pony is also on YouTube, also on Facebook, and also on Triple J's Unearthed more recently. So there's plenty going on with MC Pony. MC Pony is a hip-hop artist, very talented musician and songwriter who's extremely passionate about animal issues. So go and check out her music and also have a look at where she's performing next. MC Pony routinely performs around Australia, and I'm sure she'd love to perform overseas if you want to invite her. Anyway, that's MC Pony at Vegan Enthused. Right, now let's get down to business, people. It's a somewhat gloomy or windy day at the otherwise very lovely University of Sheffield. I'm a visiting fellow here at the University of Sheffield. I'm in my fabulous little office with a beautiful view out into a magnificent trees and ye oldie buildings. So it's just lovely being here. And this week, I'm actually joined by the person who helped make all this happen, and that's Dr. Alasdair Cochrane.
Hi, Siobhan.
Hi, Alasdair. Alasdair is Senior Lecturer in Political Theory at the University of Sheffield. And today we're going to discuss his latest book, which is called Sentientist Politics, A Theory of Global Interspecies Justice. The book is published by Oxford University Press. It comes out in 2018, and actually it was launched just this week that you're hearing this episode. So welcome, Alasdair.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So Alasdair, why this book?
Well, I guess all my previous research on animals has been thinking about what animal rights mean. So what do animal rights entail? What duties do we have as a result of animal rights? And if you're uncomfortable with animal rights for any reason, I just think of rights as a useful way of working out what our obligations to animals are, what our duties to animals are. So if you're uncomfortable with animal rights, just think about it in terms of their moral worth, or what are the implications of them having moral worth. So previous research has looked at, whether animal rights means we should stop eating them, stop experimenting on them, whether we should stop wearing them, these kinds of really important questions. And my previous research has also explored some of those questions. But with this book, I wanted to push the issue a little bit further and ask, well, what do animal rights mean politically? What do animal rights mean in terms of the institutions that we have, in terms of the political structures that we have, or even the political norms that we have? And I think actually animal rights mean quite a lot. They have quite radical implications for politics. I mean, think about human rights for a minute. Human rights obviously impose certain kind of moral constraints on our personal behaviour, but human rights also mean a great deal politically. Human rights are really taken to justify politics. So think about, why we even have political institutions. There's a very common story which says we have political institutions to protect us in our basic rights, to stop us beating each other up, killing each other, robbing from each other. Human rights are also taken to constrain politics. Okay, so we think that if politics goes too far, if leaders start imprisoning people without any reason, or start killing minorities, the justification for politics, the justification for that particular government is lost. So human rights justify politics, but they constrain politics, and they also shape politics. So human rights are also taken to determine the kind of structures we have. Human rights are the reasons why we want to do politics in an open, accountable, democratic fashion, because we have rights to participate. We have rights to be included. We have rights to be heard. So that's what human rights are doing for politics. If animals also have rights, then it seems like animals' rights should also be justifying politics, constraining politics, and shaping the political system that we have. And I think that's quite a profound thought. So the book really starts with that profound thought, which is big and scary, and it tries to sketch what our politics might look like if it took animal rights seriously. What would a politics dedicated to humans and animals actually look like?
Fascinating. I mean, it is a big idea, but when you frame it in that way, to me it seems persuasive and self-evident. Why has no one thought of this before? Or how does this build into our tradition of, say, incorporating animals into political systems in other ways?
Well, I think, other people have thought about these issues before. So there has been some important work looking at how we might incorporate animals within existing political structures, so how we might reform existing political structures and improve our animal welfare laws, or maybe we might change their status away from property or something like that. So there have been some contributions looking at some parts of that. But I think the only book that's kind of really addressed that question head on, really tried to imagine what a political system dedicated to humans and animals might look like, is the book Zoopolis by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker. I think theirs is one of the few contributions which has really started to flesh out some of the details as to what this new political system might look like. And for listeners unfamiliar with that book or who haven't read it, their answer really comes down to assigning certain animals, domesticated animals, so cats, dogs, sheep, etc., citizenship. So they think that the political system that would best serve humans and animals is one which incorporates domesticated animals into our societies as fellow citizens.
Right. But you move away from that concept. You certainly aren't relying heavily on the citizenship principle, but you are calling on established political principles to help imagine this new politic. So can you explain to us, for listeners who perhaps haven't studied politics or mightn't be familiar with these institutions, what, for example, is cosmopolitanism and how does that feed into your theory?
Yeah, good. That's a good question, because I guess the biggest departure I make from Zoopolis, the book just discussed by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker, is that my approach is a cosmopolitan approach. So the kind of politics which I endorse is a cosmopolitan form of politics. So just to explain what that means for a moment, a cosmopolitan form of politics is one that basically doesn't regard state borders and state boundaries as of important moral significance. So it rather regards individuals. I mean, traditionally, it's been an anthropocentric form of political theory, so human-centered. And traditionally, it takes the human being as the ultimate bearer of moral worth, and then seeks to set out a series of obligations and rights centered on that moral worth. And the important point is that states and their borders and their boundaries aren't of great moral significance in a cosmopolitan approach. So the classic cosmopolitan thinkers argue that we have very strong duties, very strong obligations to people who live far away from us. So it's very common for us, obviously, to have strong obligations to our co-citizens. You know, we pay taxes and have a welfare state towards people within our state boundaries. But a cosmopolitan pushes that and says, well, actually, why don't we have similar obligations to people who are starving far off, people who are suffering from tyrannical power in far off lands. Surely if it's individuals and their moral worth that's of ultimate significance, then those individuals should count, no matter where they live. Now, my approach in the book is to say, well, if it's not just humans who have moral worth, if it's not just humans that have rights, if it's actually all sentient creatures that have this ultimate moral significance, then that same cosmopolitan principle applies. We should care less about where an animal happens to reside, but focus instead on the individual animal itself and its interests. So that's a departure from Zoopolis, because in Zoopolis, they're interested in delineating different obligations depending on where an animal lives. So they grant citizenship, like I said, only to domesticated animals, whereas liminal animals, and they're the kind of pigeons and cats and rats. No, sorry, not cats, but the pigeons, the rodents, the birds who live amongst us but are wild. They don't grant them citizenship. They have a different set of rights, and then they grant a further set of rights to wild animals. So those wild animals who live far away from us, outside of our human-animal societies. My cosmopolitan approach is different. It doesn't really care about where an animal happens to live or our relations with it. It rather focuses on the individual animal themselves.
Well, for listeners who think that Zoopolis sounds very interesting, but who quite frankly can't be bothered reading it, you can also go back and have a look at the episode where Will Kimlicka was on Knowing Animals. And one of the things that I observed or I think about in relation to Zoopolis is that Donaldson and Kimlicka were really trying to embrace or reimagine established working conventions, namely citizenship. Now, when I think about cosmopolitanism, I find it very alluring, yet I wonder, is there a risk in tying the interests of non-human animals to something that is a very alluring kind of political principle, but one that isn't perhaps really working at this point in time in history, or isn't even really serving humans, for example?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Cosmopolitanism isn't having much traction here for human politics, so why push it forward for animal politics? Well, the simple answer to that is because I think it's right. So even if it's not very appealing or having much traction at the moment, I think the cosmopolitan principle is the correct one. And I think actually cosmopolitanism and animal rights are natural bedfellows, because they both share a commitment to impartiality. Just to explain what I mean there, both, I think, regard group-based membership as of little moral significance. Okay, Peter Singer obviously famously argued that it doesn't matter. Just as it doesn't matter what race you belong to, just as it doesn't matter what sex you belong to, so it should not matter what species belong to. What matters is whether you're sentient. And cosmopolitans, it strikes me, are making a very similar argument. It doesn't matter if you're British, it doesn't matter if you're Tanzanian, it doesn't matter if you're Australian. What matters is that you're a human being. So both are trying to be impartial. And yet almost no one, there's a couple of exceptions, but almost no one has seen the links between those two positions and taken the impartiality all the way down, if you like. Animal rights theorists certainly haven't thought about what animal rights means across borders in a huge amount of detail. And certainly cosmopolitans have never really thought about what it means to break down that species barrier and to think about what impartiality means across species. So, so I think they're natural bedfellows in some ways. Now, to go back to your original question, there may be natural bedfellows, but who cares, given the age of Trump and the rise of nationalism and all of that? And my answer to that is it may not have much traction here and now at the moment, and yet, if it's the right principle, it's worth putting forward and giving good arguments for, right? So the purpose of the book is not necessarily, in fact, let's just be frank, it's not to feed into policy making here and now, but rather it's to guide our political imaginations for the future. It's about plotting a route to what's just. And that's a utopian endeavour for sure, but I think it's a valuable one, because I think we ought to have some idea about what justice requires and where we want to be headed. But I also think that has practical implications too. So sometimes we have to make choices between feasible alternatives. And one way we might make such a choice is by which of those choices conforms to our idealized conception of justice. So I'll just take it on the chin, I think, that this is pretty utopian, but I think it's still a worthwhile endeavour.
Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with a bit of utopia. So, Alasdair, it's not just kind of emerging or highly kind of attractive principles that you're calling on. You're also looking to our some very tried and true institutions. So another that you turn to is democracy. Why might democracy serve animals in this way?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting work going on at the moment thinking about animals and democracy. And the reason I discuss democracy in the book is, again, thinking about the question, what do animal rights entail? Well, I think animal rights entail just institutions. I think that's what they entail. I think we have a duty to create and to maintain institutions which serve the interests of all sentient creatures. That's why the book's called Sentientist Politics. So what would those institutions look like? What are these just institutions? Well, in order to serve the interests of all sentient creatures, I think all interests need to be represented. Well, how are we going to represent all those interests in our policy making? Well, democracy provides an answer to that. That's the conventional answer. And I think it's a conventional, like you say, it's kind of tried and tested, but I also think it's valuable. I mean, it's not perhaps the democracy we have here and now, which is far removed from individuals and their interests, and there's all sorts of problems with accountability and so on. But at the heart of democracy is this idea that affected interests ought to be represented in policy making. And seeing as animals are profoundly affected by all sorts of policies that we make politically, whether it be, directly in terms of decisions about whether to cull a particular type of animal, but to more indirect policies, such as whether to burn fossil fuels, which obviously has a huge impact on the habitats of animals. Given that their interests are profoundly affected, it seems only right to me that they should be represented within our policy-making procedures. So in the book, I put forward a case for the incorporation of animal interests into our policy making. I basically argue for the democratic enfranchisement of animals.
Now, I've got some nice cat friends, and they're very lazy. They certainly, I wouldn't trust them in the chamber.
Okay.
How are animals going to get involved? How are they going to have their democratic rights enacted or advocate or be advocated for on this model?
Yeah, I see. So we might not... Okay, so we might have cats in the chamber. I'm quite open to that idea. It'd be nice to have them wandering around. But you're right, that's not going to get their interests represented very well. So I think what we're going to need are proxies. We're going to need human representatives of animals, right? So it's going to be some kind of imperfect model. It's going to be kind of one step removed, if you like. That seems kind of problematic, but it's not massively more problematic than the representation of humans. So there's 60 million people in the UK. Not all of them can fit in the chamber. So how do we resolve that problem? Well, we have representatives who are meant to act on behalf of them. And it seems to me that with sufficient imagination, we can do something fairly similar with animals. So we'd have representatives of animals sitting in the chamber, speaking for them and trying to get their interests on the agenda, but also to frame policy in a way that's less anthropocentric.
So, Alasdair, another word that you've been using quite a bit, which has a very kind of specific use in political discourse that is perhaps different to how it's used just when you're down the pub or whatever else, is justice.
Yes.
How does justice feed into this, and why does justice matter?
Well, that's a big question. Justice is at the heart of the book. So I'm trying to come up with what I believe interspecies justice demands. Yeah. And what that means is, what are animals, human and animal, entitled to? Justice is a question of what individuals are owed and what individuals are entitled to. And the heart of the book is about justice, and it's about saying, what are sentient creatures entitled to as a matter of justice? So much more than what would it be nice to do, much more than, questions surrounding, wouldn't it be good if we could just feed the wild animals, or wouldn't it be good if people were less cruel? No, the question is different to that. It's a question of justice. What are these sentient creatures actually entitled to? And I want to say, it's actually more than simply us not eating them. It's more than something like go vegan. It's actually more radical than that. It's a profound change of our institutions, structures, and norms. It's a profound change in our politics.
And why institutions? How does the concept of an institution feed into this profound change?
Yeah, good. So institutions are important. I mean, so again, to go back to human rights. So, the kind of Poll 101, why should we have politics? And there's a kind of classic argument which says something like, well, we need politics to ensure that our rights are protected. I mean, that could be the kind of, because we're going to kill each other, we're just going to start murdering each other if there's no politics. Or it could be, even if we're not going to start murdering each other, we need to feel secure that people aren't just going to come along and take our stuff, and there's going to be no comeback for those individuals who commit those kinds of crimes. So we need institutions, we need bodies which are impartial, which are neutral, but also determinate, so give us a final answer, to come in and not only protect us in our rights, but also ensure there's some redress when a rights violation does occur. So we can't just rely, I often use the example of the Wild West, or I sometimes use in my lectures the example of Kill Bill. So in Kill Bill, the movie, right, where are the institutions in that, right? So Uma Thurman just goes on this revenge killing spree. I'm always thinking, where's the police, right? Where are the courts? Institutions like the police, like the rule of law, like courts, like politics, they're important because they protect us, but they also provide us with security, okay? And that gives an important assurance to individuals that their basic interests are going to be looked after.
Wonderful. Well, Alasdair, or I should say, listeners, I highly recommend the book to you, and one of the ways in which you can support the book is by asking your institution's library or even your local library to order a copy. So the book is out now and ready to be ordered. But we're not done with Alasdair just yet, because everyone who comes on the podcast answers some quick questions. But Alasdair is a return guest, so he gets to answer 4 quick questions. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. What's been the most satisfying aspect of conducting animal studies research?
Yeah, the thing I love most about doing animal studies research is it just more and more fascinating questions keep coming up. Any political issue is suddenly transformed if you take animals seriously. So my research agenda for the next 40 years is mapped out nicely, because any political question you can think of. I'm asking the big question about how is politics itself transformed if you take animals seriously. But, moving down a bit and thinking about some more slightly more micro issues, they're absolutely transformed if you take animals seriously. Think about issues like migration. Migration's a big issue politically at the moment. If animals count politically, if they have some kind of political status, think about what borders do to animals in terms of stopping their migration. Literally, some animals die because their migratory routes are stopped. Just tons and tons of fascinating questions open up.
Wonderful. What's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of doing animal studies research?
Yeah, there's no doubt that it can be disheartening at times, and for many of us, it's because there's such a huge gap between what we're advocating and the reality, and that's often presented to us starkly when we present at conferences, for example, and everyone's raising their eyebrows. But also when you're making grant applications, for instance, grant applications are obviously tied to money from the government who are interested in research to do with certain things, and the kind of research we do doesn't obviously and always tie neatly to those funding bodies.
Yes. Now, this is your opportunity, Alasdair, to give a shout out to an animal studies scholar that you would like to make listeners aware of. It can be an emerging scholar. It can be someone who writes in a language other than English. It could be someone who's writing in an adjacent field. Who would you like to name?
Oh, can I name a few?
It's tradition on this show.
Okay, so there's a ton of interesting stuff going on to do with animals and food at the moment, and one great example of that kind of research is Josh Milburn, who you had on a few weeks ago. His stuff's absolutely fascinating. There's also some really good literature coming out at the moment on related to seemingly harmless wrongs that you might do to animals. Can we disrespect them or violate their dignity even if they kind of feel nothing as a result? And Angela Martin at the University of Freiburg is investigating some of those things. A colleague of mine, Angie Pepper, has written some great articles which are kind of similar to the thrust of what I've been arguing in the book about cosmopolitanism and animals. She's coming at it, I've kind of come at it from an animal's perspective. I've come to cosmopolitanism from animals, and I think she's taken a kind of different route. She's come to animals from cosmopolitanism. But her stuff's really good. So yeah, there's three scholars to keep you going.
So final question, are you optimistic about the future of human-non-human animal relations?
I've got to be. Otherwise, it would be too tough writing this stuff. I know there's lots of reasons to be disheartened. I don't need to recount the facts about the scale and numbers of animal suffering. But, just in terms of people becoming on board with these ideas and people starting to think about these ideas and take them seriously, this podcast is obviously a great example of how many great people there are out there doing this kind of research. But just more personally, I teach a class on animals, ethics and politics. I've been teaching it for the last 4 years, and it's just grown. It's not huge numbers, but it's grown from a small class to a fairly big class. And each year there's more and more students, and each year more and more of those students are switched on to these ideas and these debates. And so that's encouraging to me.
Wonderful. That's very encouraging. Well, Alasdair, what are you working on next?
Yeah, I've got 2 projects coming up. One is a short book I'm writing on the question of should animals have political rights. I'll give your listeners an exclusive. The answer is yes.
Oh, goodness me.
But I'll spend a few words justifying that position. And then further down the line, a bit more long term, I'd really like to start a project looking at the question of animals and the military. So both the employment of animals for military purposes, the ethical issues that are raised by that, but also the effects of military action and military conflict on animals, as collateral damage and having their habitats destroyed. I think there's some big, important ethical questions to answer there.
Fantastic. So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter. So I'm on Twitter, Alasdair Cochrane without an E. You can also find my work on the Department of Politics at the University of Sheffield webpage. And of course, also we have a lovely animal studies research centre here in Sheffield called the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre, Shark with a C. And that also has a webpage which lists some of the stuff that's going on here in Sheffield.
Fantastic. Well, Alasdair, thank you so much. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast, where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can also follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at SO_S. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast and to learn all about animal issues. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.